This storage system clearly isn't working. Let's make some inexpensive clamp racks that will fit anyone's budget. The coolest thing about both of the clamp racks we're going to build today is they use less than a sheet of plywood combined. We're going to start by building this slim hand clamp rack. We need to cut down our plywood into 7 4.5-inch strips. If you don't have a table saw, you can easily use a circular saw for this step. It won't cause an issue at all. With all 7 strips cut, we're going to leave 4 as is, and then the other 3 we're going to need to cut down just a little bit to make work. 2 of them for the sides we're going to cut down to 36 inches, and for the center support we need to cut it down a little bit smaller to 34.5 inches. With all the pieces cut to size, now we need to do a little bit of work to get everything to fit together right. The center support needs a couple of notches taken out of each end to accommodate the back supports. Don't measure if you don't have to. I used some cutoffs from earlier to trace out these notches, which gives us the perfect size. I cut out these notches on my bandsaw, but if you don't have a bandsaw, a jigsaw does a great job of cutting out small areas like this. Before we get to assembly, we need to drill the holes for the pipe that is actually going to hold our clamps. The easiest way to make sure all of these holes line up perfectly is to make a little sandwich of our 2 side pieces and our center piece. I used some cutoffs here to even everything up and then clamp them down. I measured 3 inches down and 20 inches down from the top to mark where my pipes are going to go, and then I used a long drill bit to drill through all 3 layers to give me a pilot hole for my Forstner bit. To accommodate for the pipe, I used a Forstner bit that was just a little larger than my 3/4 inch conduit. On all the side pieces, I only drilled about halfway through to give a nice place for the conduit to rest, and on the center support, I put a little bit of backer underneath and drilled all the way through. This will give a support in the center so the bar doesn't sag. With our holes drilled, it's time to start assembling, and we're going to start with these 2 L structures at the top and bottom. We're just going to be using a little bit of glue and some brad nails to keep everything together. It should work perfectly fine and be strong for years to come. Before we get everything else assembled, I like to throw a little paint on all of my shop furniture to make it all match. This is totally optional, but I like to do it in my shop to have a nice aesthetic everywhere. I love the exposed edge of plywood, so I'm sanding all the paint off the edges so that plywood really pops. It's a cool look. This rack is a little too large for my workbench, so I just laid everything out on the floor for final assembly. Again, I'm just using some glue and some brad nails, and this goes together super quickly. Order of operations is really important on this assembly. We're going to put one end and the center support in first, but we're going to wait to put in that last end so we can accommodate the metal conduit that's going to hold our pipes. We're going to cut our conduit down to right around 48 inches. You're going to want to make sure to measure your rack before cutting it to make sure it's the perfect length. If it's too long, your second end won't connect, and if it's too short, it'll wobble all around. It's no good. With the conduit in place, put on the second end, and you're all finished with the build. When mounting your rack, be sure to find some studs because it can get really heavy, full of clamps, and you don't want it ripping off the wall. The large back support panels make it simple to run some screws through the rack and into the studs to mount it on the wall securely. With the clamp rack mounted, it's time to sort out all those beautiful clamps and get them hung up. I love how quick and accessible this clamp rack is. You can see all the clamps of any shape and size you have and quickly grab them off the rack. It makes it so much easier and faster whenever you're working. The second clamp rack we're going to be building is designed for long parallel clamps, and we're going to start by cutting the largest parts, which are the top and the back. Again, I used a chop saw and a table saw for all these cuts, but if you don't have access to those, a circular saw will work just fine. Next, we have these triangular clamp supports that we're going to cut. I'm going to use the table saw to cut all of these down to 9-inch by 9-inch squares. If you don't have access to a table saw or a crosscut sled that we're going to use to cut the triangles, you can easily leave it like this as all square and it will still work perfectly fine. On the crosscut sled, I'm cutting all my 9-inch squares down into triangles. This just gives it a little more interesting shape than having everything be square. I'm also going to chop off the ends of the triangle so there's nothing pointy or sharp to poke myself on in the shop. For the sides of the clamp rack, we have a very similar shape. They just need to be a little longer. So we're going to use relative measurements of the squares we just cut to make sure it's the same 9 inches. And then we're going to cut these down to a 9-inch by 13-inch piece. Again, we're going to cut this triangular shape into the sides, but if you can't do that, it's not a big deal. It's just a cool look. To figure out the right spacing for the clamp supports, I find it easiest to lay out all your clamps just how they'll be on the wall and measure them out. With relative measurements taken, I like to just lay it out on the rack and use some wooden spacers to get all the spacing perfect. I can also mark out exactly where all of the shelves are going to go so I can pre-drill for all of the screws. These clamps can be pretty heavy, so I like to put 2 or 3 screws per support board. I'm again going to hit it with a little bit of the gray paint so it matches the other clamp rack, as well as sanding down all those edges to make that plywood pop. With our placements marked out and our holes pre-drilled, assembly is pretty straightforward. I'm using a little bit of super glue to keep everything in place until I'm able to flip it over and put the screws in. This is a really great trick to get things going together quickly. With the supports glued in place, we can flip the rack over and drive the screws in from the back. Because we pre-drilled all the holes, this is a really simple process and we don't have to worry about missing any of the supports. With everything connected, I touched up the paint on the back panel, and the final step is just attaching the top. For the top, I wanted to put a little bit of detail on it, so I routed a little chamfer into the edges. This is just an aesthetic look, but I like it. I also painted the top blue, which kind of gives it a cool look. I wedged in a scrap piece of wood to keep the side square before putting on the top. The top is a little larger than the rest of the rack, so you have to even out the overhang to make sure it looks perfect. Then we're going to attach it to the rest of it just using some simple brad nails. With the clamp rack finished, it's time to get it mounted up on the wall, and I have the perfect space to do that. There's conveniently a sheet of plywood on the wall here, so it was really simple to mount it up on the wall, just driving some screws through the back of the rack and into the plywood. I love how customizable a clamp rack like this is. You can easily space out the supports or the size of the rack to fit exactly your clamp collection. For me, I don't have too many of these parallel clamps, so a pretty small rack works well, but you can do whatever works for you. I love how these clamp racks turned out. If you want some for your own shop, be sure to check the link down in the description for full plans. And until next time, it's your turn. Go build stuff.